All right, kiddos. So this will be the Chapter 18, Lecture 1, continuing with our unit on minerals and land resources. So the reading that will accompany this particular lecture is pages 401 through 408, found in your textbook. And what we'll do today is discuss ecosystem services provided by various natural areas. We will describe world land use, contrast different philosophies for land use, and describe the various levels of protection provided by wilderness areas, national parks, etc. And we'll talk about this concept of natural regulation. All right, so first things first here, we are going to talk about tragedy commons, bring this concept back to the forefront of our minds. So this is something we talked about way back, I think it was actually Unit 1. And so remember, Garrett Hardin wrote about this struggle between common areas, people's tendency to want to benefit themselves in the short term, even though it might be at the expense of long-term welfare of themselves and others. All right? And so essentially when you have a common area that no one is specifically in charge of managing or taking care of, those common areas tend to be degraded over time. And it's because of this that we have lots of federally or state-managed land. So essentially there's grazing and forests and stuff like that. But rather than just leaving that open, the public land's open for people to just go after and extract resources and use how they wish. These lands are managed by government agencies with scientists and environmental law and all this stuff that comes into play to help make sure that we're not just over time degrading these natural resources that we rely on. Okay? So if you look at land use worldwide, urban areas encompass only 3% of the overall land use, right? Rock, ice, tundra, so non-productive land is about a third of our land, all right? And that leaves about 26% forest, 26% is permanent pasture. We call those rangelands, by the way. Might as well bring that term up now. Okay, 12% is what we consider our prime farmland, and then wetlands, lakes, etc. make up about 3% of our area. Okay, so back when we did our ecological footprint calculation, right, it's this chunk of land right here that we are factoring in as potential land that can support human life. This rock, ice, tundra, and desert, non-productive land didn't factor into that equation. All right? So in the United States, 55% of the land is owned privately. So people with their own private ranches for grazing, their own private crops, homes, yards, etc. The remainder of the land is owned by the government, whether that be the state government or the national or federal government. It depends, okay? And we have various agencies within the government that are in charge of managing that. So we've got what's called the Bureau of Land Management, the Forest Service, Fish and Wildlife Service, National Park Service, etc. The Corps of Engineers deals with a lot of our streams and so on. Okay, and again, those are the departments or the bureaus that are in charge of managing federal land for various reasons. Okay, now, if you look at a map of the United States and where we have federally owned land that's devoted to national parks or wildlife refuges, etc., you notice that most of that federally owned land is in the western U.S. and Alaska. Okay, as you go east, a lot of the land ownership and stuff kind of predates environmental policy and land management guidelines. Okay, so there are two kind of competing philosophies for how our federally owned or public lands should be managed. One of those philosophies is what's called the wise use movement, and these would be more I guess that they're in favor of this idea that federal lands, which are public lands, need to be used to stimulate economic growth. They should be used for resource extraction. They want to deregulate the way that land is used, right? So, the whole Ammon Bundy, okay, who is kind of the forefront of that whole the Malheur National Wildlife Refuge occupation, the armed occupation that occurred there. Those would be extreme members of this wise use movement. Okay, they feel like, hey, that's public land. We should be able to use it how we see fit. There shouldn't be government bureaucrats in our way telling us how we can use that land. All right. Of course, they're that extreme section of that philosophy, but nonetheless. And then, of course, we have our environmental movement, which is sort of counter to this wise use movement, is that really we have these public lands, these federal lands, and they should be set aside to protect biodiversity from human use, like resource extraction, etc. Okay, so you feel like, we should block logging as much as possible, block mining as much as possible on these public lands. Okay, and legislation then that occurs and who decides what happens is a constant battle between these two movements, and it often involves compromise from both sides. All right, it's kind of the way the government should run in that case. All right, so during class, I was going to have you guys do this, but we fell a little bit behind on notes. But just kind of as a lead-in to the next section here, we have national forests, we have wildlife refuges, national parks, and wilderness areas. And just as a precursor to the rest of the slideshow, I'm going to ask you to pause here in a second and rank. What do you think is the most protected, and what do you think is the least protected in terms of human influence or human development? Okay, so which type of land preserve do you think receives the most legal protection, and which one do you think receives the least? Kind of rank those in order. So hit pause, see if you can do that, and then I'll come back and we'll go over that in just a second. Did you pause? Did you? Did you? All right. Anyways, so in reality, right, our national forests, okay, would be our least protected, okay, in terms of what we're allowed to do with that land. National forests, they are managed by the National Forest Service, and logging is allowed with permits, right? So it's managed. They don't just let people come in and log at will. They have this system in place for when can be logged and how long in between, and they have systems in place for what has to be replanted and so on. So they are protected, they're managed, but not to the degree the other three are. The next least protected would be wildlife refuges. Okay, so wildlife refuges are plots of land set aside for conservation, but people can still hunt and fish, and it's not illegal for resource extraction to occur on some of our wildlife refuges. National parks would be second. That'd be places like Yellowstone, Mount Rainier National Park, North Cascades, Olympic National Park. And these are places where we still want people to go to visit, but there is to be no logging, there is to be no mining, there is to be no drilling for oil and natural gas. None of that is allowed on our national parks. And then most protected from human influences are wilderness areas. All right? So wilderness parks is a protected area of land which no human development is permitted. So that means our national parks, for example, have roads and building structures. Our wilderness areas, the only thing they allow in wilderness areas is maybe some trails for some backcountry backpacking and camping. All right? And so in 1964, we set aside federally owned land as part of the National Wilderness Preservation System. They're given the highest level of protection. Okay? And then depending on its location is which bureau or agency is in charge of managing it. All right? So some areas have a limited number of permitted guests, human guests, to reduce impact. So typically if you want to go backpacking through wilderness areas, you fill out a backcountry permit and you allow a certain number of people in over time. You can kind of see here that this is pretty wild, right? And that's the idea, is to kind of let nature and the wilderness do its thing with minimal human impact. So they're pretty well protected. The only thing they're really not safe from are what are called invasive species, which are species brought in maybe from other continents that are not native to that area. It's kind of hard to control which species go in and out. Wild species go in and out of a wilderness area. But it is safe from other human impacts like mining and hunting and fishing and so on. All right. Here in Washington, we have lots of different wilderness areas. These purple areas are our national parks, right? And the green outlined areas are our wilderness areas. So again, national parks, similar to our wilderness areas, we're not allowed to do resource extraction. But we do build roads. We do have structures built like, museums and visiting lodges and stuff like that. So Teddy Roosevelt is credited with creating our national park system, by the way. Currently 58 national parks, although that number does grow over time. And the primary goal of a national park is not so much to just simply protect wilderness and the wildlife, although that is part of their goal. It's also to get people to come appreciate it and educate people about the environment and management of natural resources. Sometimes our national parks are historical sites as well. Okay. Now, because lots more people are going to national parks than wilderness areas, we do have crime and vandalism and traffic and associated pollution with those things, right? And whenever lots of people do that, of course, they try to cheat the system and abuse the resources, okay? I forgot to bring this up with the wilderness areas, but both national parks and wilderness areas, okay, they stick to a policy of what's called natural regulation. And so what natural regulation is essentially there's no hunting permits, for example, to try to keep numbers of moose or deer down. There's no, if there's a wildfire, they just let it burn within the confines of the park or wilderness area because wildfires are a natural part of ecosystem evolution, okay? So they don't suppress wildfires. They let nature just kind of do its thing. They let the predator-prey relationships run free. Okay. Now, if a wildfire starts in a wilderness area and it appears like it's going to extend beyond the boundaries of the wilderness area, they may do some work to try to prevent that. But other than that, they have a let-it-burn philosophy. They let nature do its thing. And that's in both national parks and wilderness areas. All right. Wildlife refuges are different from national parks and wilderness areas in that they're still conservation-minded, right? They represent every major ecosystem found in the U.S., okay? Their mission is to preserve land and water for the conservation of fishes, wildlife, plants, and plants in the U.S. But in our wildlife refuges, we allow recreation, including hunting and fishing, as long as it doesn't impede conservation efforts. So most national parks, sometimes fishing's allowed, but often not hunting, okay? And wildlife refuges could have some resource extraction. And so it's not illegal necessarily to drill for oil and natural gas on a wilderness or wildlife refuges, as long as it doesn't impede the conservation efforts. And that's the key. So if an oil company said, hey, you got this national wildlife refuge up in Alaska, we'd like to drill for oil, it'd be upon them to show how they can do so without impeding conservation efforts. If they can prove that to whatever agency is in charge of that wildlife refuge, then they could technically apply for a permit to drill. Okay? That is it for today. That should give us a good start. We're going to talk in class tomorrow about forestry and how the National Forest Service manages national forests, okay, which are the least protected of our wilderness or of our federally owned land.